The gravel road, long abandoned to weeds and neglect, clawed at the underside of my sedan. Each crunch and scrape was a tiny violation, a dissonance against the precise order I usually maintained. My hands, calloused and nimble from years of coaxing beauty from decay, gripped the steering wheel with an almost uncomfortable tenacity. I was Reid, an antique restorer whose life revolved around meticulous processes, the careful dismantling and reassembly of forgotten things. My world was one of controlled environments, of solvents measured to the milliliter, of wood grains patiently coaxed back to their original luster. This inheritance, this sprawling, forgotten manor, was an affront to everything I held dear and yet a challenge I couldn't refuse. The estate gates, rusted iron teeth half swallowed by overgrown ivy, loomed ahead. I had to get out, wrench them open myself, the metal groaning in protest like an ancient beast disturbed from slumber. A faint, earthy scent, heavy with damp soil and something else, something stagnant and sweet, like forgotten fruit, clung to the air. It was a smell I knew, the aroma of deep neglect, but here it felt, denser, almost a physical presence. The drive wound through a tunnel of skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the overcast sky. They seemed to lean inward, whispering secrets to each other, their leaves long since surrendered to autumn. The air grew colder as I approached, the kind of pervasive chill that seeped into bone, regardless of the car's heater. And then, through a parting in the gnarled canopy, it appeared. The manor wasn't merely old, it was a ruin frozen in time, a grand dame fallen into disrepair. Its stone facade, once a proud declaration of wealth, was now a mottled canvas of lichen and grime. A turret, capped with a verdigris-stained copper dome, leaned precariously, as if perpetually on the verge of surrender. Patches of the roof had caved in, leaving gaping wounds through which the elements had clearly waged a long, successful war. My breath hitched. This was more than a restoration project, it was an excavation. My hands, which typically worked with the delicate precision of a surgeon, felt suddenly inadequate. The scale of it was overwhelming, a tidal wave of decay threatening to drown my usual methodical approach. Could I, Reid, bring order to this chaos? Could I resurrect the ghost of its former glory? I parked the sedan in what was once a grand circular drive, now just a cratered expanse of broken flagstones and tenacious weeds. No birds sang near the house. The air tasted of damp earth and something acrid metallic like old blood. I walked towards the main entrance, my boots crunching on gravel. The heavy oak door, studded with black iron, sagged on its hinges. One panel was split, a jagged fissure running from top to bottom, as if something had tried to burst through from the inside. It felt porous, almost spongy in places. The door groaned, a long, drawn-out shriek of tortured timber and rusted metal as I pushed it open. A gust of stale, frigid air, thick with the scent of dust and rot, rushed out to greet me. It was like opening a tomb. The air was utterly still, heavy and motionless, as if it had been trapped here for decades. I took a tentative step inside, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud on the marble floor, which was obscured by a thick blanket of dust and fallen plaster. My eyes, accustomed to discerning minute details, tried to pierce the gloom. Everything was draped, suffocated by the passage of time. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, a subtle awareness of being watched, not by a physical presence, but by the house itself. It felt like a living entity, dormant but aware, slowly unfurling itself in response to my intrusion. This was not the familiar, comforting hum of old wood settling or the benign creak of an ancient floorboard. My first objective, beyond merely surveying the damage, was practical: locate the main power. The estate agent's notes, scribbled almost illegibly, had mentioned a boiler room in basement. Basements, in my experience, were rarely pleasant places, but here, in this house, the thought felt particularly unsettling. Finding the basement door proved easier than expected, tucked away beneath the main staircase, almost an afterthought. It was unlocked. I pulled it open. I reached for my heavy-duty flashlight, its beam a stark, artificial sun cutting through the gloom. The steps down were steep, uneven stone, slick with moisture. Each descent felt like a step deeper into the house's core, away from the dwindling light, away from the world I knew. The smell intensified, becoming almost cloying. The flashlight beam finally landed on it, a hulking cast-iron monstrosity, the boiler. It stood like a silent sentinel in the center of the room, its intricate network of pipes and valves a rusted skeletal framework. The boiler room and basement was small, cramped, and the air here was utterly dead, devoid of any natural circulation. Condensation beaded on the exposed pipes and stone walls, giving the whole space a clammy, tomb-like feel. My gaze swept across the room. There were old coal bins, their contents long since exhausted, leaving only a residue of fine, black dust. Shelves lined one wall, laden with forgotten tools, rusted and fused into grotesque shapes by time and damp. But it wasn't the decay that truly held my attention. It wasn't the boiler. It was too subtle, too organic. It was the house itself, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very stone beneath my feet. This was more than neglect. It was an ancient, settled stagnation. I had woken something up. My hands, calloused and nimble from years of coaxing beauty from decay, gripped the steering wheel with a tension I rarely allowed myself. The manor loomed, a monolithic shadow against the bruised twilight sky, its skeletal branches clawing at the fading light. A shiver, not entirely from the evening chill, traced its way down my spine. This place was a project, yes, a magnificent challenge, but it already hummed with an unsettling quiet. The next morning the air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant pine. I approached the manor's front door with my toolkit, the familiar weight of my canvas bag a comforting anchor. The lock, a rusted relic of a bygone era, yielded with a protesting shriek. Inside, the air was thick, stagnant, tasting of dust and the slow decay of forgotten things. My first task was simple: assessment. I needed to understand the scope of the neglect, to map the manor's secrets before I could begin to peel back its layers. I started on the ground floor, moving methodically from room to room, documenting damage, noting architectural details. The silence was profound, broken only by the scuff of my boots on grimy floorboards and the occasional creak of the house settling deeper into its foundations. After several hours, my attention was drawn to a heavy oak door near the back of the house, tucked almost imperceptibly beside a pantry. It led to a steep, narrow staircase spiraling downwards, plunging into an absolute inky blackness. This, I surmised, would lead to the manor's unseen guts. I retrieved a powerful lantern from my kit. At the bottom, a single, low-ceilinged corridor stretched ahead, ending at another heavy door, this one made of riveted iron. A faint, metallic tang hung in the air, mingling with the pervasive damp. This was it, the boiler room in basement. Pushing the door open, I stepped into a cavernous space dominated by a monstrous, cast-iron boiler, its pipes snaking across the ceiling like petrified serpents. Rust painted everything in shades of ochre and deep crimson. My light played across shelves laden with corroded tools, ancient coal scuttles, and forgotten odds and ends. It was a time capsule of forgotten utility. I began to clear a small section of a workbench, intending to set up a temporary staging area for some of my smaller tools. I laid out a set of chisels, a fine-bristled brush, and a magnifying loupe, arranging them with my usual precision. I turned to examine a section of pipework, sketching its configuration in my notebook. When I looked back, the loupe was gone. My brow furrowed. I was certain I'd placed it right there beside the chisels. I scanned the immediate area, then the entire workbench. Nothing. A prickle of unease started at the back of my neck. Perhaps I'd simply misremembered. It happened occasionally in moments of deep focus. I shrugged it off, reaching for another loupe from my kit. Not a floorboard settling, but something else, a dragging sound almost rhythmic. I paused, listening intently. It stopped. Just the house, I murmured aloud, the sound of my own voice startling in the vast space. My fingers snagged on something rough. I brought the lantern closer. Etched into the thick, grimy metal, just above a pressure gauge, was a symbol I didn't recognize. It wasn't a manufacturer's mark or a maintenance inscription. It was crudely carved, almost clawed into the iron, a series of intersecting lines forming a jagged, asymmetrical star, surrounded by what looked like a dozen tiny, distorted human figures, their limbs twisted, their heads thrown back in silent screams. This wasn't neglect or decay. This was deliberate, and it felt wrong. I traced the symbol with a gloved finger, the rough edges sending a strange vibration up my arm. The feeling of being watched, which had been a low hum since I arrived, intensified, becoming a distinct pressure on my back. I spun around, sweeping the lantern beam across the room. The boiler room was empty save for me and the hulking machinery. The air seemed to grow heavier, pressing in. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady my racing thoughts. My meticulous nature demanded an explanation, a rational cause for the misplaced loop, the phantom scraping, the unnerving symbol. I was no longer simply restoring a house. I was unearthing something else entirely, something that had been waiting, and it knew I was here. The bruised twilight had bled into a deeper, impenetrable black by the time I finally allowed my grip on the steering wheel to loosen. The manor, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised sky, seemed to exhale the cold into the evening air. Its presence was a physical weight, settling on my shoulders as I stepped out of the vehicle, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots the only sound in the suffocating quiet. I told myself it was just the isolation, the sheer scale of the task ahead, that made my skin prickle, but deep down, a more primal unease had taken root. The next morning, I dove into the work. The sheer volume of decay was overwhelming, yet it was precisely this challenge that usually sharpened my focus, silencing the extraneous chatter of the world. I moved from room to room, cataloging the damage, assessing the structural integrity, my fingers tracing the ornate, dust-choked woodwork. There was a rhythm to it, a methodical dance with deterioration that I found profoundly satisfying. But even as I worked, a nascent sense of being watched, a persistent chill that had nothing to do with the manor's lack of heating, began to fray the edges of my concentration. My immediate priority was the utilities. Without power or water, the restoration was a non-starter. This meant a descent into the house's subterranean depths, a journey I approached with a mixture of professional resolve and growing trepidation. The air grew heavier with each step down the winding stone staircase, thick with the scent of damp earth, stagnant water, and something metallic and faintly acrid, like old, corroded blood. Cobwebs, thick and resilient as fishing nets, draped from the low, arched ceilings, catching the weak beam of my headlamp. Finally, I pushed through a heavy, groaning wooden door, its hinges screaming in protest, and found myself in the boiler room in basement. The space was a sepulchre of forgotten industry. A colossal iron boiler, rusted to a deep, flaky ochre, dominated the center of the room, its intricate network of pipes snaking across the ceiling like petrified veins. The floor was a mosaic of cracked flagstones, slick with condensation, and the air hung still and heavy, tasting of coal dust and decay. My breath plumed in the frigid air. I began to inspect the old system, my gloved hands running over the cold metal, searching for the source of the manor's long-dormant life. It was while I was examining a section of the wall behind the boiler, where the main water pipe disappeared into the stone, that I noticed it, a patch of masonry subtly different from its surroundings. The stones here were smoother, cut with a precision that didn't quite match the rough-hewn blocks around them. And one, near the bottom, just above the skirting, was recessed ever so slightly, creating a hair-thin seam that caught the light from my lamp. I knelt, my fingers probing the almost invisible crack. The stone shifted. I pressed harder, working my fingertips into the gap, and with a soft, grinding sigh of displaced mortar, the stone gave way, pivoting inward. I shone my lamp into the recess. Nestled within, almost perfectly preserved despite the damp, was a small leather-bound journal. There were no markings on the cover, no title, no author, just the smooth, featureless hide. I pulled it out, the leather creaking faintly. It was heavier than it looked. Back in the comparative light of the main hall, I sat on an overturned crate, my headlamp still illuminating the musty pages. The script inside was archaic, faded ink on brittle parchment, but legible. It wasn't a personal diary, not exactly. It was a chronicle, a series of disjointed observations and warnings, written in a hand that grew progressively more frantic. The entries spoke of the erosion, a creeping blight upon the mind, a gradual vanishing of the self. They detailed local disappearances, not of bodies but of identities, people remaining. The final entries were almost illegible, a frantic scrawl about the forgetting, a plea for anyone to remember. The last page was blank save for a single stark word, repeated over and over, diminishing in size until it was a pinprick of ink. Empty, empty, empty. I closed the journal, the slick leather cool against my palm. This wasn't some local legend, not just folklore. The tone, the sheer desperation in the fading script, felt too real, too raw. Rising from the crate, I felt a peculiar lightness, a momentary disconnect. As I reached the bottom step, I paused. What was I supposed to be doing next? The schedule, the list of immediate repairs I'd meticulously planned just this morning, had vanished from my thoughts. It was like trying to grasp smoke. I shook my head, a sharp, dismissive gesture. Exhaustion, I decided. I was tired, and the journal had unsettled me more than I cared to admit. That was all it was. A momentary lapse, nothing more. I forced myself to recall the next step, pushing through the mental fog until the image of the corroded water pipes in the kitchen finally surfaced. The peculiar lightness that had settled over me after closing the journal lingered, a disquieting hollowness where my focus usually resided. It wasn't relief, nor was it fear in its purest form. It was a disconnect, as if the very air around me had thinned, making my own thoughts feel distant. The desperation in that fading script, the implicit horror of something that could steal memory and identity, clawed at the edges of my resolve. This wasn't some quaint historical curiosity. This was a warning, a desperate cry from the past, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I had to understand it. My meticulous nature, usually a comfort, now felt like a curse. The next few days became a blur of dusty archives, microfiche machines, and flickering screens in the nearest town's small public library. The librarian, a stout woman with spectacles perched on her nose, gave me quizzical looks as I devoured local histories, old police blotters, and forgotten newspaper clippings. Most of the manor's records were fragmented, lost to time or perhaps intentionally suppressed. But fragments, when pieced together, began to form a mosaic of unsettling truths. A stable hand in 1887 vanished without a trace. A visiting scholar in 1912, last seen walking towards the estate's imposing gates. A young woman, a distant relative of the original family, in the summer of 1948, her diary found open to a page detailing growing confusion and a sense of being watched. More disturbing were the instances of madness. Brief mentions of previous occupants or their guests descending into profound melancholia, speaking of lost thoughts or stolen moments before being quietly removed from the public eye. But to me, reading it now, it felt like a mirror. The research wasn't just mentally taxing, it felt like an invitation. The entity, whatever it was, seemed to sense my deepening investigation. My nights grew long and twisted, plagued by vivid nightmares that clung to me even after I startled awake. One afternoon, I was meticulously cataloging some of the manor's original blueprints, trying to match them against the current structure, when a waking hallucination seized me. The faint scent of damp earth and something acrid, like burnt sugar, filled my study. It was tall, impassably thin, and seemed to absorb the light around it. My breath hitched. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. The door solid and unmoving, the scent vanished. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, trying to rationalize it away as fatigue, a trick of the light. The memory gaps began subtly, then escalated with terrifying speed. At first, it was small things. I'd set down a tool, turn my back for a moment, and it would be gone, only to reappear in a place I swore I hadn't put it. Then I'd find myself in a different room of the manor, unsure how I'd arrived there. A blank space in my mind where the journey should have been. I'd pick up a book I was certain I'd never seen before, only to find my own annotations scrawled in the margins. One morning, I was downstairs, searching for a specific type of solvent I needed for a particularly stubborn stain on a carved mantelpiece. I was sure I had left it on the workbench in the main workshop. When it wasn't there, a flicker of irritation went through me. I checked the library, the drawing room, even the kitchen. Nothing. The air grew heavier with each step, the scent of mildew and stale earth intensifying. I navigated the labyrinthine passages, my boot soles crunching on scattered debris, until I reached the boiler room in basement. The massive, rusted iron boiler stood like a dormant beast, its pipes a tangle of ancient arteries. I scanned the shelves, the dusty floor, the nooks and crannies. And there, tucked behind a stack of forgotten kindling, was the solvent. I picked it up, a wave of confusion washing over me. I had no memory of bringing it down here, let alone hiding it. This was a deliberate erasure. I stood there, the solvent bottle heavy in my hand, my mind a churning mess of fragmented facts and dissolving recollections. How much of my mind was already gone? How much more would I lose before I understood what was happening? The meticulous restorer, the man who prided himself on clarity and precision, was slowly, terrifyingly coming undone. The dull ache in my temples, a constant companion since I'd arrived, intensified, throbbing in rhythm with some unseen pulse. I needed to do something tangible, something that anchored me to the present, to my work. The manor, despite its malevolent undercurrents, still had practical demands. Heating, for instance. The old pipes had groaned and rattled since my arrival, but no true warmth had ever permeated the stone. It was time to confront the belly of the beast, the true heart of the manor's mechanical decay, the boiler room in basement. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight and a wrench I barely knew how to use, I descended the uneven stone steps. The air grew immediately cooler, thicker with the scent of damp earth and something acrid, metallic rust, perhaps, or the forgotten residue of coal. My boots scraped on loose grit, each sound amplified by the cavernous space. The flashlight beam cut through the absolute black, revealing a landscape of forgotten industry. Massive, cast-iron behemoths, their pipes a tangle of corroded arteries, dominated the space. Dust, thick and undisturbed, coated every surface, a fine gray blanket over decades of neglect. The silence here was different from the rest of the house. It wasn't merely an absence of sound, but an oppressive weight that pressed against my eardrums, daring any noise to break its reign. I navigated around a towering, cylindrical boiler, its rivets like stitches on old skin. A drip somewhere in the unseen recesses echoed irregularly. Drip, pause, drip. It was the only rhythm in the tomb-like quiet. Then a sound that wasn't a drip. It wasn't mechanical, it felt organic. It vibrated through the concrete floor up my legs, a subtle tremor that set my teeth on edge. I stopped, my flashlight beam sweeping wildly. Nothing, just the inert machinery. The dust motes dancing in the light. Hello? My voice was a weak croak, swallowed immediately by the vastness. I felt foolish, but the hum had been undeniable. As I moved deeper towards a smaller secondary boiler, the air grew suddenly heavy, as if the very oxygen was being drawn from my lungs. Not distinct words, just a sibilant rush, like dry leaves skittering across a vast, empty expanse. It swirled around me, coming from all directions at once. Too low to decipher, too pervasive to ignore. My heart began to hammer, a frantic drum against my ribs, betraying my determined facade. Reid, a voice breathed thin as smoke right beside my ear. It was my own name, but distorted, elongated, as if spoken through water. I spun, wrench raised instinctively, but there was nothing. The flashlight beam danced across the grimy walls, the skeletal pipes. I forced myself to focus, to breathe. It was a trick of the acoustics. The old pipes, the echoing space. I tried to rationalize, to cling to the logical framework of my world. I needed to see the pressure gauge on the main boiler. I pushed past a stack of rusted metal drums, my foot catching on something soft. I stumbled, the flashlight beam momentarily pointing at the floor. And there, nestled amidst decades of grime and discarded parts, was a small, intricately carved wooden box. My breath hitched. I knew this box. It had been perfect. Gleaming, now it was caked in a thick layer of reddish-brown dust. One corner splintered, the brass tarnished to an ugly green. It looked as if it had sat here untouched since the manor's earliest days. My mind reeled. This was impossible. I had delivered it. I had received payment. I remembered the exact feel of the wood under my fingertips, the faint scent of beeswax polish. But here it was, undeniable, a physical contradiction to my own memories. I knelt, reaching for it. My fingers trembled as I brushed away the dust. The wood beneath was rough, untreated, nothing like the smooth, lustrous surface I remembered crafting. This wasn't just dirt, it was decay. The workshop, the tools, the careful sanding, it was there, vivid and clear. But then, a subtle shift. The memory blurred, the details receding, replaced by a strange blankness. I tried to remember the client, the name of the person I'd sold it to. Just an empty space where a crucial piece of my past should have been. It wasn't just a forgotten detail. It was an excised chunk of my recent history. The hum intensified, no longer just a vibration but a deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to shake the very foundations of my skull. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the box. My gaze fell upon a grimy, cracked mirror propped against a far wall, reflecting my own terrified face. But it wasn't quite my face. For a fleeting, horrifying second, the eyes staring back were not mine. The box felt heavy, not with its own weight, but with the crushing weight of a memory that had been stolen, overwritten. My breath hitched, a choked sob escaping my throat. I looked at my hands, the hands of a restorer, hands that knew the grain of wood, the feel of aged metal, but did they? Could I trust what they had done, what they remembered? My name, Reid, felt like a foreign word on my tongue. Who was I? If my memories could be so easily erased, replaced, or simply vanish, what was left of me? The memory of the restoration process, of the client, of a name I couldn't quite grasp, it gnawed at me. A void where details should have been. It wasn't just a fleeting forgetfulness. It was an active erasure, a smooth, terrifying blankness. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the fog of my meticulous routine. This wasn't right. Nothing about this manor was right anymore. I had to get out. My hand instinctively went to my pocket, fumbling for my mobile phone. The screen flickered to life, a ghostly pale rectangle in the gloom of the hallway. No signal. I tried again, walking to the grand, dust-sheeted drawing room window, then to the front door, even out into the overgrown portico. Nothing. The landline. There had to be an old landline somewhere. I vaguely remembered seeing a dusty rotary phone on a small table near the main staircase, a relic I'd intended to clear away. I hurried back inside, my footsteps echoing too loudly on the bare floorboards. The phone was there exactly as I remembered it. I lifted the receiver, dead, a flat, lifeless buzz. I pressed it down, lifted it again, jiggled the cord. A knot tightened in my stomach. This wasn't simply a remote location, it was a cage. I moved to the massive oak front door. I pulled at the ornate handle, but it wouldn't turn. Locked. I remembered locking it. Habit, a security measure. My hand went to my trouser pocket, then my jacket, my keys, they weren't there. I patted myself down, a frantic search, growing more desperate with each empty pocket. Where were they? But the memory was thin, like tracing a drawing on damp paper. There was a latch, a heavy bolt, but it was set from the inside. I could see it, feel it. But the key for that mechanism, gone or perhaps never there. The ground floor ones, which I'd meant to repair, were either painted shut with decades of neglect or secured with internal latches that seemed to have fused with their frames. I put my shoulder to one, grunting with effort, but it didn't budge. The glass rattled ominously, but the frame remained immovable. Up on the first floor, the windows were too high or led to sheer drops onto unkempt shrubbery. A rising tide of helplessness threatened to engulf me. Every exit, every avenue to the outside world was sealed. It felt deliberate, not just the decay of an old house. It felt personal. I needed to think. I needed a way out. There had to be a service entrance, a cellar door, something less grand, less imposing. My mind, despite its growing holes, latched onto a vague recollection of a basement access point, something mentioned in the solicitor's initial overview. A utility entrance, perhaps, or a coal chute. The light from above faded quickly, swallowed by the gloom. The basement was a labyrinth of forgotten rooms and storage spaces. Dust motes danced in the anemic light, like tiny, frantic spirits. I moved past stacks of decaying furniture, forgotten crates, and cobweb-draped machinery. It was the boiler room in basement. I recognized the heavy, steel-plated door, chipped green paint peeling like diseased skin, the source of the thrumming. I pushed it open. The heat hit me first, a dry, metallic warmth. The air was thick, tasting of iron and something else, something subtly organic, like old blood mixed with ozone. In the center of the room stood an enormous cast-iron boiler, a monstrous, antiquated heart that pulsed with a low, guttural vibration. I scanned the walls, desperately searching for anything that looked like an exit, a forgotten passage, a service tunnel. My eyes landed on the far wall, behind the boiler itself, a section that seemed different, not the rough, irregular stone of the rest of the basement. This section was smoother, almost unnaturally so, covered in a thin, grayish plaster that was cracking and flaking away. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and scraped at the plaster. It wasn't painted, but seemed to be a raw, heavy iron plate, set flush with the wall. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't on any plans I'd seen. This wasn't a structural wall. It was a door, an impassable door. As I cleared more of the plaster, a design began to emerge on the metal surface. Not a simple handle or hinge, but an intricate, almost ritualistic etching. It was a symbol, a series of interlocking angular lines that formed a complex sigil. I knew this symbol. I had seen it before, but where and when? The knowledge was there, a ghost of a memory, tantalizingly close, yet utterly out of reach. It was like trying to recall a name that dances on the tip of my tongue, except this wasn't just a name. This felt like a fundamental piece of my history, my identity, irrevocably linked to this place, to this impassable hidden door. The manor wasn't just isolating me, it was twisting me, erasing me, one crucial memory at a time. The symbol on the boiler room door was a key. I knew it. a key to something terrible, but the entity had already taken the lock from my mind. I was trapped, not just by physical barriers, but by the insidious decay of my own self. The boiler hummed louder, a hungry, waiting sound, and I knew with a horrifying certainty that I was slowly becoming a part of its forgotten history. The glass rattled ominously, a thin, frantic vibration against my palm that did nothing to reassure me. The manor had gone quiet again, a heavy, expectant silence that felt like a weight pressing down on my eardrums. I tried the window again, straining, but the wood groaned back at me, unyielding. It was useless. Every ground floor exit I'd encountered was either sealed by time or deliberately secured. The realization settled in my gut like a stone. I was trapped. A cold dread, distinct from the damp chill of the house, began to seep into my bones. My own mind felt like a house of cards, constantly on the verge of collapsing. The past few weeks had blurred into an indistinct smear, punctuated only by fleeting moments of terrifying clarity and the unsettling sense that I was losing pieces of myself, like dust motes disappearing into the gloom. There was this part of it. There was this isolation, this inescapable prison, a deliberate act. I needed to think, to find something, anything that made sense. My memory, what little solid ground remained, told me there was a way to the basement from the kitchen, a narrow, creaking door I'd always meant to reinforce. The basement door, a squat, unpainted slab, stood ajar. A draft, smelling of earth and decay, snaked out, carrying with it a faint, rhythmic thrumming. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible, but once I noticed it, it burrowed into my awareness, a slow, insistent pulse. I pushed the door open, revealing a precipitous flight of stone steps descending into utter blackness. My hand fumbled for the lantern I usually kept by the back door, but it wasn't there. Another missing detail, another blank in my mental ledger. With a sigh that felt too loud in the sudden quiet, I pulled out my phone, its weak beam slicing a hesitant path through the dust-choked air. The descent was treacherous. Each step echoed unnaturally, the sound swallowed by the vast, unseen space below. Something faintly organic, like dried blood or old, forgotten meat. The thrumming grew louder, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very stone beneath my feet. At the bottom, the phone light revealed a labyrinth of low-ceilinged passages, rough-hewn stone walls glistening with moisture. Pipes, thick as my arm, snaked overhead, dripping an oily residue onto the floor. This was where the manor truly breathed. This was where its heart beat. The passage opened into a large, cavernous space. This was the boiler room in basement. My phone light danced over colossal iron tanks, rusted valves, and a network of pipes that looked like the exposed arteries of some ancient mechanical beast. At the center stood the boiler itself, an enormous, squat cylinder of riveted iron, radiating a faint, residual heat. The thrumming resonated from it, a deep bass note that vibrated through my chest. But it wasn't the machinery that held my gaze. It was the wall behind the boiler, scrawled directly onto the stone. Partially obscured by flaking paint and grime were crude, disturbing carvings. They weren't the intricate patterns I'd found upstairs. Below them, scratched into the mortar with furious urgency, were words. Not English, not Latin, but a language I recognized from the strange symbols in the manor's oldest texts, a language I'd only ever seen in fragments, dismissed as decorative flourishes. Now, as my eyes scanned the words, something clicked. A memory, raw and painful, tore through the fog in my mind. The old caretaker's ramblings, the half-finished phrase in the forgotten journal in the library, the unsettling pattern on the attic beam, they coalesced, forming a horrifying tapestry. The eater of self, the ancient root, feeds on the echoes, identity given, memory consumed. My breath hitched. The words on the wall, combined with the sudden, brutal clarity of those fragmented memories, painted a picture of absolute horror. This wasn't a ghost, not a simple haunting. It was an entity as old as the earth beneath the manor, a parasitic intelligence that had rooted itself here. The loops connecting them, I now understood, were the tendrils of its influence, its psychic hooks. It fed on the experience of being human, on the unique tapestry of a life lived, slowly replacing those vibrant threads with its own manufactured delusions, its own distorted reality. And then I saw the final, most terrifying revelation. Scrawled beneath the merging figures, almost an afterthought, yet stark in its implications. To appease the hunger, a full life given, a complete erasure, for the manor to sleep. It wasn't just about feeding, it was about appeasement, a full life given, a complete erasure. It demanded an entire identity, a whole person to be consumed completely, leaving nothing behind. Not just a memory here or there, but the totality of a being. My own blurring memories, the moments of confusion, the faces I couldn't quite place, they weren't just symptoms. They were the entity's tendrils already at work, slowly, meticulously, stripping away Reid, piece by agonizing piece. My hands began to tremble, the phone beam shaking wildly across the ancient writing. The thrumming of the boiler felt like the beating of a monstrous heart, a heart that was slowly, inexorably, beginning to beat in time with my own. The ultimate cost wasn't death, it was something far worse. It was the absolute annihilation of self, the transformation into a puppet animated by something else entirely, and I was already well on my way to becoming its next, final sacrifice. The truth, revealed in the damp, echoing confines of the boiler room, was a death sentence for my very soul. The air in the boiler room in basement was a thick, humid blanket, heavy with the metallic tang of rust and the acrid, forgotten scent of coal dust. Condensation wept down the cold brick walls, tracing dark, glistening paths that caught the faint, flickering glow of my battery lantern. The ancient boiler itself, a behemoth of riveted iron and corroded brass, hummed with a low, guttural thrum, a sound that seemed to vibrate not just through the floor, but through the very bone in my skull. My mind, what was left of it, felt like a mosaic shattered and hastily reassembled by clumsy hands. Gaps yawned where memories once resided, fragments of faces and names drifting just beyond my grasp. I knew I had a past, a life, but the details were smudged, like charcoal drawings rubbed raw by a careless thumb. Yet within this crumbling edifice of self, a singular, cold clarity had begun to solidify. It wasn't just about hunger for the entity. It was about completeness. It didn't want scraps. It wanted the whole tapestry, every thread of identity. Every experience, every thought, utterly consumed until nothing remained. My own blurring memories were not random acts of decay, but deliberate surgical excisions, preparing me perhaps for that final, total feast. I ran a trembling hand over the rough, damp brickwork. It was a place of pressure and transformation, of water turning to steam, of raw energy harnessed. And in my current state, it felt like the only place where clarity could pierce the fog. If it demanded a full life, a complete identity, what if I could give it one, not my own, not entirely? The thought, when it first flickered, felt like a betrayal, a final surrender to madness. It wasn't about saving my identity anymore. That ship had sailed, its sails torn, its mast broken. It was about stopping it from claiming another, from continuing this slow, insidious feast. I had spent my life restoring, piecing together fragments, understanding the essence of what something once was. Now I would use that perverse skill to create. I would fabricate an identity, a simulacrum of a life, filled with enough detail, enough emotional resonance to appear real, to appear complete. A meticulously crafted bait, a ghost in the machine, designed to satiate or, failing that, to trap. The plan was a desperate gamble, born of a mind teetering on the precipice. I would construct a life, a story, a persona. I would imbue it with memories, with triumphs and failures, with loves and losses, all borrowed, all invented. I would pour myself into it, not to become it, but to give it enough of my own fading essence to make it irresistible. And then I would offer it, here in this very room. The boiler room, with its confined space, its pulsing heat, its groaning metal, felt like a crucible, a place where something could be forged or utterly destroyed. I could almost hear the entity's unseen presence shifting, drawn by the intensity of my focus, by the very idea of a bountiful offering. The immense personal sacrifice was clear. To create such a detailed, compelling illusion, I would have to draw from the deepest, most intact parts of my own fractured memory. I would have to revisit the fading echoes of my own life, not to reclaim them, but to sacrifice them, to weave them into the fabric of this fabricated soul. The act of giving birth to this false identity would surely consume more of my true self, blurring the lines further, perhaps irrevocably. I might become the ghost I sought to create, leaving nothing but an empty vessel behind. This was the only way. If the entity demanded a totality, then I would give it a totality, a carefully constructed one, a cage of identity built from my own unraveling mind. I began to pace the damp concrete floor, the soles of my boots scuffing softly, My eyes, darting around the boiler room, saw not just corroded pipes and peeling paint, but a stage, a ritualistic space. The pressure gauge on the boiler, its needle trembling slightly, seemed to mark my own internal strain. I would need objects, tangible anchors for this invented life. Trinkets, photographs I could alter, letters I could write. Things that would carry the scent of a false history, the weight of a manufactured identity. And I would need to imbue them with my dwindling emotions, my remaining spark of being, to make the offering potent. The air grew thick, not just with damp heat, but with an almost palpable presence, a hungry waiting. It knew, or it sensed, the coming meal. My blood felt like ice in my veins, but my resolve hardened. This was not about victory, not in the traditional sense. It was about containment. It was about a final, desperate act of defiance, even if it meant my own complete erasure in the process. I would give it a life, yes, but one that was a trap, a dead end. I would become the architect of my own undoing, if that's what it took to stop the entity's endless consumption. My hands clenched into fists, gripped tight against the grime. The hum of the boiler intensified, a low, predatory growl. I was ready, or as ready as a man could be when facing the complete dissolution of his very self. The game was set. The sacrifice immense. The ancient boiler loomed, a multi-limbed iron beast, its cold skin sweating. I stood before it, my breath clouding in the damp air, a small, meticulously carved wooden box clutched in my left hand. This was it. My plan felt absurd, a desperate gamble born of a mind already fraying at the edges. The entity consumed memory, identity. My countermeasure, an act of creation, of recollection, performed at its heart. I placed the box on a rusted, overturned bucket, its surface surprisingly steady. It was an unfinished piece, a small, intricate keepsake box of rosewood and mother-of-pearl inlay, a project I'd started months ago and left suspended in time. Now it was my anchor. From my satchel, I carefully extracted the last, tiny sliver of a ballone, iridescent and fragile, along with my grandfather's smallest chisel, its handle worn smooth by generations of hands. I leaned in, my focus narrowing to the unfinished inlay, the precise cavity waiting to receive the shell. What is this? A child's game? My hands trembled, but I forced them steady. The chisel felt familiar, solid. I remembered the grain of the rosewood, the specific curve of the pearl. Each detail was a tether, a defiant assertion of who I was. I brought the chisel to the abalone, preparing to shave the thinnest edge. Then the first fissure appeared, not in the wood, but in my mind. A sudden, jarring blankness. What was I doing? This box. Why was it important? The abalone in my hand felt alien, its sheen mocking my uncertainty. Had I always been an antique restorer? I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting it. Reid, my name is Reid. I restore forgotten things. This box is one of them. It is mine. When I opened my eyes, the boiler room in basement seemed to shift. The condensation on the walls thickened, forming grotesque, fleeting faces in its glistening trails. That name. I am a forgotten echo, a dust mart in a decaying house. I ignored it or tried to. My fingers, guided by instinct, pressed the abalone against the wood, a perfect fit. I reached for the minuscule pot of resin, my movements practiced, precise. But as I uncapped it, the memory of how to mix it, the exact proportions vanished. A gaping hole. Panic flared. No, this was my craft, my identity. I stared at the resin, then at the box. The shell, so perfectly placed moments ago, now seemed haphazard, ill-fitting, a clumsy patch. Had I even placed it correctly? My skill is a borrowed cloak. The voice slithered, now seeming to come from the very air I breathed. A pale imitation. I remember nothing of its true mastery. I remember nothing of myself. Images flashed behind my eyes. A different man, older, with hands like mine, but stronger, more confident, completing this very box. My grandfather. Or was it me, from a time I couldn't recall? The lines blurred. Was I merely remembering his craft, not my own? Had I ever truly restored anything? I forced the resin onto the inlay, my hand shaking. It was too much, too little, I couldn't tell. The abalone, once so vibrant, dulled to a flat gray. The rosewood twisted, its grain warping into a grotesque, snarling face. The boiler room in basement itself seemed to press in, the brick walls pulsating. The sound of dripping water escalating into a frantic, rhythmic thrum, like a monstrous heart. Let me fill I, let me give I purpose. I will be a vessel, a memory of a memory, an echo of what was once great. A terrifying clarity broke through the fog. This wasn't just about consuming my memories, it was about replacing them, making me a part of its forgotten, twisted narrative. It wanted to make me an extension of the manor's endless, desolate past. No, I wouldn't let it. I dropped the chisel. My hands, despite the tremor, found the small, smooth stone I had brought, a polishing stone I always used for the final, critical stage of restoration. It was cool, grounding. I gripped it tight, pressing it against the dull abalone inlay. This wasn't just about restoring a box. It was about re-establishing myself. Every stroke of the stone against the shell was an act of defiance, a reclaiming of my own history. I remembered the first time my grandfather had shown me this stone, the weight of it in my child's hand. I remembered the smell of his workshop, the specific scent of beeswax and sawdust. I remembered my first successful inlay, the joy, the pride. The entity shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, as if my memories were physical barbs. The boiler room in basement convulsed. The lantern flickered wildly, threatening to die. The boiler itself groaned, a sound of agony and rage, and the pipes vibrated with frantic energy. The faces in the condensation stretched into silent screams. I resist, fool, there is nothing left to hold on to, but there was me asterisk. I bore down on the stone, polishing, feeling the friction, the gradual return of the shell's inner fire. I remembered my name, Reid. I remembered my parents. I remembered the first antique I'd ever loved. The entity tried to twist them, to show me grotesque versions. But I held fast. I focused on the truth, on the concrete, undeniable facts of my own existence. The abalone began to gleam, a vibrant, ethereal blue, then green, then fiery red, pushing back against the encroaching grayness. I felt a surge of strength, not physical but of will. Its grip on my mind loosened just enough. I saw the box clearly now, the beautiful rosewood, the perfectly set inlay. It wasn't just a box, it was a testament to meticulous care, to the persistence of form, to the enduring power of identity. With a final, resolute stroke, the abalone flared, reflecting the flickering lantern light with dazzling intensity. It was done. The box was complete. A guttural roar echoed through the boiler room in basement, a sound of pure, unadulterated defeat. The air went still, the pulsating walls ceased their terrible rhythm. The condensation froze in place, the ghostly faces hardening into static horror. I stood there, panting, the polishing stone still in my hand. The box on the bucket glowed faintly, a quiet defiance, but I was here. I was Reid, and I remembered every single, terrifying, precious detail. But its hold on me, its power to erase, had been broken. I had fought for myself, and I had won for now.